This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Hey, welcome to 12 Donuts, almost Halloween, the only holiday I actually bother to celebrate on this channel. In the past, we've talked about how horror movies use sudden high notes to startle you and long low notes to create a sense of unease, but this year I want to do something a little different and take a look at what they do to those notes. Specifically, I want to look at every metalhead's favorite effect, distortion. It's a great way to make anything sound creepy and unnatural, but why? Well, in order to understand that, we first have to talk about one of my favorite topics, sound waves. These come up a lot on this channel because I'm a huge tuning nerd, but most of the time I'm just talking about the frequency of the wave. This is a measure of how many times per second it hits your ear, and it's what determines the note's pitch. Today though, we're going to have to look at another feature of sound waves, shape. Basically, while frequency tells you how long the pattern takes to repeat, shape tells you what it's doing in that time. Technically speaking, sound is a pressure wave moving through air, and the way that pressure changes over time can have a profound impact on what we hear. Probably the simplest shape is the square wave, which just switches on and off. Here's a slowed down approximation. This is fairly common in older electronic music because it's really easy for a simple computer to generate, but it doesn't actually sound particularly pleasant. The sudden shifts from low to high and back again feel unnatural and more than a little uncomfortable. Remember that? It'll be important later. A nicer sounding shape is the triangle wave, where instead of just jumping back and forth, we increase or decrease the pressure at a constant rate like this. This prevents those sudden jumps that made the square wave feel so harsh, but these sharp changes in direction still make it a little bit rough. We can also combine the two using a sudden jump up and then a slow slide down to make what's called a sawtooth wave, which earns its name by feeling even more jagged than the square wave for when you want something that sounds really nasty. Oh, and also it's shaped like a saw. These are all electronic signals though. Natural waves tend to take on a much smoother shape called a circle wave or sine wave. Here we've rounded out all the sudden shifts, creating a mathematically smooth curve that takes us from our peaks to our valleys with as little harshness as possible. When you sing or play a note on an acoustic instrument, you're generating these sine waves. Or rather, you're generating a complex pattern based on sine waves, but we'll get to that in a bit. First, what does this have to do with distortion? Well, the first uses of distortion come from blues guitarists in the 40s and 50s when pioneers like Muddy Waters began to adopt the recently invented electric guitar in order to be heard over the rest of their band. These guitarists quickly realized that if they turned their amps up loud enough, they could distort the sound, getting a cool, gritty tone that added a bit of extra bite to their playing. This created what we now call overdrive distortion, or just overdrive, and it worked based on an effect called clipping. You see, early guitar amps were pretty limited. They could only generate so much pressure, and if you pushed them past that point, they just sort of gave up. Say you put in a sine wave with a volume of 8 decibels. Oh yeah, decibels is a unit of volume, basically how high and low your peaks and valleys are. Anyway, let's say you try to play an 8 decibel wave, but your amp can only produce up to 6 decibels. It does its best, playing as loud as it can whenever your sine wave goes over the limit, but you still lose this nice, beautiful curve because the amp just can't handle the nuance. Instead, you get this plateau, which makes the whole thing start to look like our old friend, the square wave. While the wave is within our 6 decibel limit, it gives us that nice sine wave equality we're looking for, but as soon as we step outside, the best we can do is flatline. Compare this sine wave from earlier to this version, which I intentionally clipped. Overdrive still leaves most of the sound intact though, which gives it a warmer tone than other, more destructive kinds of distortion, like, say, distortion. Okay, the names can get a little confusing because we didn't plan them out in advance, but distortion is the term we use to describe a medium level of distortion. Does that make sense? I think it does. Anyway, basically, if overdrive represents pushing your amp a couple decibels past where it wants to go, distortion just means pushing it even further. Well, sort of. In practice, modern distortion pedals usually just directly alter the sound wave instead of messing around with forced clipping and whatnot, but the principle is the same. As you might imagine, this starts to do some serious damage to your sound wave. Compare this to this. So we've seen overdrive, which is light distortion, and distortion, which is medium distortion, but what if we go even further? Well, the realm of truly heavy distortion is usually called fuzz for obvious reasons. Here we abandon all pretense of sounding like an actual amp and instead just start smashing the sound wave with a wrench. Fuzz pedals can be dangerous because you risk covering up all the dynamics and tone in your playing, but if you use it carefully, it can be a really powerful tool. So why does messing with a sound wave like this make it sound so rough anyway? Well, I could get into the science and math of it all with fancy words like Fourier analysis and inharmonicity, but Yeah, okay, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Buckle up, kids. We're going in. Up to now, we've been assuming that your sound is basically a sine wave, but that's very rarely the case. You see, when you play a note on, say, a guitar, you get that fundamental frequency, which is a sine wave, but you also get what are called harmonics, or overtones. These are additional frequencies created by the resonance of your instrument, and they're generally multiples of your fundamental, so if you played this A, which has a frequency of 110 Hz, or cycles per second, you'll also wind up with shades of 220 Hz, 330, 440, and so on. These are natural acoustic phenomena, and different instruments will emphasize different overtones, but more or less any frequency that's a multiple of your starting note is probably gonna sound fine over it. But you can also add notes that aren't multiples, like if we take that guitar A again and add a tone at 196 Hz, it doesn't fit. These frequencies, called inharmonic overtones, disrupt the well-ordered harmonic series we're looking for, and the more of them we add, the less structured the note sounds. At the extreme end of this are things like snare drums, whose overtones are so messy and inharmonic that they don't really have any identifiable pitch at all. They just sound like noise. So what does this have to do with distortion? Well, remember how we said that waves come in different shapes? That's only sort of true. Mathematically speaking, any wave can be constructed by adding sine waves together. When two or more of those sine waves are played simultaneously, they interfere with each other. When both waves are high at the same time, they constructively interfere, combining to make that segment even higher pressure, and the opposite happens when both waves are low. If one is low while the other's high, though, they destructively interfere, effectively canceling each other out. So if we take a wave at 110 Hz and one at 220, we can see that these peaks line up with each other, creating even higher peaks, while these ones line up with the valleys here, canceling out. If we put them together, we get something kind of like this, which looks like our 110 wave, but the peaks are narrower and the valleys have this sort of W-like shape. I drew that freehand though, so please don't judge it too harshly. Anyway, we can keep adding frequencies, creating more and more complex waves that I'm not even gonna try to draw. This process creates what's called a Fourier series, and literally any wave can be made, or at least almost perfectly approximated, by this approach. Even the square and sawtooth waves from earlier are actually just the product of lots of sine waves stacked on top of each other. When those waves hit our ear though, they get deconstructed again, breaking up into their constituent parts for processing, and this is where those inharmonicities come back into play. If you start with one note, you'll just get back multiples of that fundamental, but if you go around chopping bits off of more complex waves, you can introduce whole new frequencies, and since most real sounds are already fairly messy, it can get pretty out of hand. Basically, your notes are still there, but distortion adds a bunch of extra noise on top of it. And that's pretty much it. Distortion is more or less the result of imposing artificial caps on the volumes of sound waves. These caps don't really happen in nature though, at least not like this, so the resulting noise feels, well, unnatural, and it puts us on edge because deep down in our subconscious, we know the things we're hearing shouldn't actually exist. Distortion is a triumph of modern technology, and we're mostly using it to write songs about monsters. Aren't humans amazing? And speaking of modern technology, let's talk about this video's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a streaming platform from the founder of the Discovery Channel that delivers all sorts of great documentaries right to whatever device you watch stuff on. One title I'd recommend is Inside a Virtuoso's Brain, which, you know what? Why don't I just show you? This documentary explores the world of incredibly skilled musicians, examining what makes them so good and asking whether they're actually so different from the rest of us. It includes discussions of neuroscience, genetics, and of course practice, training, and environment, and it's just one of thousands of documentaries available to CuriosityStream members. Beyond music and the arts, they also have features about history, science, nature, and technology, all of which you can stream whenever and wherever you want. They even have a whole collection just for David Attenborough documentaries. Anyway, back to the paper. If that looks interesting, they're offering 12-Tone viewers a free 30-day membership. Just click the link in the description, then use the promo code 12-Tone when signing up. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our Patreon patrons for supporting us and making these videos possible. If you want to help out and get some sweet perks like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes with a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.